This is a Sikha from Likutei Sichos, Chelik Yutes, Parsha Shoftim Sikha Aleph. And the topic of the Sikha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn about the mitzvah of Seim Tosim Olech Melech, of appointing a king. And there are three parts in the Sikha. The Rebbe will, number one, ask why a Melech is compared to a lave, to a heart, and not to a Reish Moyach, to the head and the brain. Number two, explain the difference between a Nasi and a Melech, and between a lave and a Moyach. And number three, according to this, answer the question. In our parsha, we learn about the mitzvah of Minui Melech. The parsha says, Soim Tosim Olecho Melech. And the Rashba writes regarding a king that HaMelech Kitzibur, the Melech, the king, is like the Tzibur. Shat Tzibur v'chol Yisrael tuluyin by, because the Tzibur and the entirety of Klal Yisrael, they're totally in the Melech. And in Medrash Tanchuma it says something similar. It says Shereish Hader Hu Kol Hader, the head of the generation is the whole generation. Or in the words of Rashi, Shenasi Hader Hu Kechol Hader Ki Anasi Hu Hakel. So we see over here this idea that the Melech is like the Tzibur. He's Kol Hader, Nasi Hu Hakel. And the Rambam writes regarding a king, Sheliboy Hu Leiv Kol Kahal Yisrael, that the lave of the king, the heart of the king, is the heart of the entire Klal Yisrael. Now, simply, the reason why a melech is lave kol kahal Yisrael, in the words of the Rambam, is because just like the chayas of the whole body depends on the lave, so too kol kahal Yisrael depends on the king, as the Rashba writes, Shat Tzibur v'chol Yisrael tluyin by. However, there's a difficulty over here, and that is, even though all the limbs of the body receive their chayas from the lave, however, the control of all the limbs of the body and the leadership of all the limbs of the body depends on the mayach, which therefore, even though compared to all the limbs of the body, we say that the lave is called the melech, nevertheless, the reish is the melech of all the limbs, including the lave. So compared to the rest of the body, the lave could be called the melech. But when we look at the whole body in its entirety, so then we say that the reish and the mayach is the melech of all the limbs. And so, if so, why is a melech whose inyan is to lead the nation? It says, Asher Yitzim v'Asher Yavim. He's the leader, like the reish and mayach. So why is he compared to a lave, to a heart? Another point which makes this question even stronger is that in Torah Shebeksav we also find the title Nasi being used for a melech. It says Asher Nasi Yechta, and it says in Sifra and in the Mishnah that a Zeu Nasi, Ze Melech. Similarly, Melech HaMashiach is called the Nasi. So we see this term Nasi, this title Nasi, also being used for a melech. However, nevertheless, the title melech is greater than Nasi, which, as we find, as a result, that you could even have a Nasi of an individual Shevet. You can't have a Melech of an individual Shevet. So we have these two titles being used for a Melech, that of Melech and that of Nasi. And nevertheless, the title Melech is greater than the title of Nasi. And now we find in the Medrash that Nasi Ader is called Reish Ader. We mentioned in the Medrash earlier. So when Rashi said, Nasi Ader hu kechol Ader, ki Nasi hu akel. And the Medrash says, what's a Nasi Ader? Reish Ader hu kol Ader. That's what Rashi is based on. So we see that the Nasi Ader is called the Reish Ader. So now the question is even stronger. Not just that a Melech is compared to a Lev instead of being compared to a Reish. The question is stronger. How can it be that a melech who is greater than a nasi is only leiv kol kahal Yisrael and not the reish, whereas the nasi is the reish? So we have the title melech, we have the title nasi. The title of melech is greater than the title of nasi, and nevertheless, the title of melech is compared to the leiv, and the title of nasi we find is compared to a reish and mayach. So the question is stronger than our original question, which was just, how can it be that a melech is just a leiv and not the higher level of reish? The question is stronger because we find that a lower level of nasi is compared to the reish, whereas the melech is only compared to the leiv. So we'll understand this by first explaining the following. So this is going to lead into the answer to our questions. In the Lashon of Chachamim, there's a fundamental difference between the title of Nasi and the title of Melech. We said that in the Torah, Nasi and Melech are two titles, two names of the Melech. Nasi could be used for other things as well, but Nasi and Melech can refer to the Melech, whereas in Lashon Chachamim, there's a fundamental difference between these two titles. They're referring to two different roles, two different positions. A melech is literally a king, just like in Lashon Torah. So if it says melech, it means a king, just like when it says melech in Lashon Torah. However, when it says nasi, so a nasi is a different role, it's a different position. A nasi is primarily a nasi of the Sanhedrin, the one in charge of the whole Sanhedrin, or at the least, it's a nasi in Yanim Ruchnim. So when Chacham refer and speak about a nasi, it means a nasi in Ruchnisdika matters. And as the Mishnah says, nasi v'av bezdin. They're both connected to the bezdin. And as the Gemara also says, Hillel shekerin oischa nisi Yisrael, and it's referring to Hillel in his role in Inyanim Ruchnim. And it also says Hillel v'Shimon so nagu nisi yusin b'fnei habayis mea shana. And that was even though there were Yiddish Malachim and Kosher Malachim during this time. So obviously when it says Nagu Nesiyusin, it wasn't talking as Malachim, because there were Malachim then from the house of the Chashmonayim. It refers to a Nasi in Inyanim Ruchnim. So in Lashon Chachamim, it's talking about two different positions, two different roles. And this difference is to the extent that there's a fundamental difference also in halacha between them, which is that a Nasi shemachal al kvedei. So kvedei machal, a nasi that forgives, he forgoes, he's meichel, is covered, so it's forgiven. Whereas a melech shemachal al kvedei ain't kvedei machal. A melech who forgives, he's meichel and is covered, it's not forgiven. So we see that there are two different roles with two different halachas that apply to them. Now, according to this, we can say, and it makes sense to say, that similarly there's a difference in Lashon Torah between the levels of Nasi and Melech in the Melech himself. So even though in Lashon Torah, when it says Melech and Nasi, you can refer to one person, it's not two different people, but we can explain based on the way we find it in Lashon Chachamim that it's referring to two different levels, two different aspects within the Melech. Now let's look further into these two different roles of Nasi and Melech. Among the differences between a Melech and a Nasi in Lashon Chachamim, so there's two differences. We're going to present the first one on this slide and the next one on the next slide. So the first difference is that a Melech, the Indian of a Melech, is laseis mishpat umilchames. It's about taking the Yidden into war when that's necessary. Whereas the pasuk says, Asher yitziyim v'asher yavim, again it's referring to battle. However, his role is not Heirah. And not only is his role not Heirah, that doesn't define him, but actually the halacha is that Malchei Yisrael are not allowed to judge at all. So not only is it not their role, Malchei Yisrael are forbidden to take that role. And even Malchei Beis David, who can judge, but nevertheless it says that Ein Meshivin Eisim B'Sanhedrin, they can't be part of the Sanhedrin. So not only is their role not Heirah, they're actually forbidden to some extent or completely to be part of the Inyan Haverah. And when it says that the Rambam says that the role is lasis mishpat u'mochamis, it says lasis mishpat. So lasis mishpat doesn't mean in the form of hayra, of halacha, but rather it means to implement the mishpat of the Sanhedrin, of the Bezdin, or it means the mishpat that a king institutes. Sometimes the king has to establish certain laws based on the needs of the time, the circumstances that make it necessary. Whereas by a nasi, the main inyan of a nasi is that he's the Rosh HaSanhedrin. As Rambam says, Hagadol b'chachma shebekulan, so meshivan eisei reish aleim, v'hu reish yeshiva, v'hu shekerin eisei chachamim nasi b'chol mokem, v'hu ha'emet tachas Moshe Rabbeinu. So the nasi, it says over here clearly, the Rambam writes that Hagadol b'chachma shebekulan, he is the reish yeshiva, and they call him nasi b'chol mokem, and he takes the position of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rambam says, what's the Sanhedrin? They are the Amudei Ha'ira, Umehem Choikum Mishpat Yetzel L'Chol Yisrael. So the Nasi is all about Ha'ira. That's what defines the Nasi. Now by Moshe Rabbeinu it says, Huay Tachas Moshe Rabbeinu. It's just that since Moshe was also the Melech Yisrael, so Moshe had both roles, and so he also dealt with all of the needs of the Yidden in general, not just Ruchnis, but also Gashmias. But that's the first difference between a Melech and a Nasi. A Melech, his Inyan is to take the Yidden into battle, into war when that's needed, and the role of the Nasi is to establish Hayra and Halacha. A second difference between a Melech and a Nasi is that by a Melech, the nation has to provide his every desire. And as the Rambam writes at length in Perek Dalet of Hilchos Malachim, that v'lekech min ha'am ha'gibayrim, he takes from the people the gibayrim, v'esem l'chayim l'merkavte, loretz lufanov. So he takes people from among the nation to serve him, and also lekech min balahu manies. He takes things from people that are craftsmen that he needs. V'lekech hasadis, he takes fields. V'leish le'maisem and azrayim, he takes a portion of the produce that grows. Whereas by a nasi, even though he's supported by the tzibur, however, it's only that he takes his set livelihood, his parnasa from them for working for them. So it's not that they're providing for him, it's that he's providing them a service and they're paying him in exchange. Unlike a melech who the nation provides for his every desire. So number one, by the nasi, it's in exchange for work, so it's not really that they're providing it. He provided something and they're paying him. And number two, it's not his every desire. There's a set amount of parnasa that he gets. Whereas by the melech, everything is being provided for by the nation, and they provide him with his every desire. Now, this second inyan, that a king takes everything from the nation, so it actually reflects a paradox. On one hand, it reflects a strength. It reflects the strength and power of the melech, how the whole nation and everything that they possess is actually similar to the inyan of Mashakona Eved Kona Rabbi. They're like his servants, they're his avadim, and so whatever they acquire, he acquires, and so he could take whatever he wants from them. On the other hand, it actually also reflects a weakness of the melech, that for any and all of his desires, anything, he needs the nation. He has nothing of his own. All people, they receive their livelihood through their own work and effort. Even a parnas, like we said before, someone who serves the tzibur, and he gets paid by the tzibur, but his work is, he does have work, that he's a parnas on the tzibur, and they pay him for his work, but not so a melech, that everything that he has, he receives from the nation. He doesn't get paid, it's receiving from the nation, so he's dependent on the nation. And the explanation is that he hanesenes. We have this question that there's this paradox. It's a strength and a weakness. They actually work together perfectly. They're not a paradox. Each one explains the other. The whole inyan of a melech is asher yitzim v'asher yavim, to serve the people. That's the identity. That's the mohus of the melech. And therefore, since that's his whole mohus, so he has nothing of his own. So he receives everything from the nation. So his whole existence is to serve the people. That means he has no existence outside of the people. So he doesn't have anything of his own, nothing that he earns, and everything that he has comes from those people. Because those people, the nation, they are his entire existence, his serving the people. So on one hand, he therefore has complete control over them. They, so to speak, belong to him, and at the same time, he in a way belongs to them, because his whole entire existence, it's not a role that he plays. His entire existence, his whole mahus, is to serve the nation. And based on this, we can now answer our questions. So according to this, we'll understand the comparison of a melech specifically to a leiv and not to the reish umayach. Among the differences between a leiv and a mayach are two things. Number one, that the leiv is in a constant movement of rotzav v'shoiv, which is the heartbeat. It's without stop. Whereas the mayach doesn't have any movement. The chayas of the whole body comes from the mayach, but the mayach itself is at rest. And the second difference is that the leiv is brought down is the weakest of all the limbs of the body, whereas the mayach, it isn't the weakest of all the limbs of the body. And we can explain that these two qualities that each of them has are related to one another. The leiv is the weakest of all the limbs because its entire existence and being is that it's the highest of the limbs. Because that's its entire existence, so it's a weak existence on its own. It is no other inyan, only that it's the highest of the body. And therefore, number one, we said that it's in constant movement. Because of this, it's constantly in a state of movement, which reflects that it's constant and entire existence and being is that it's the highest of the body, and the body needs highest the whole time. So the leiv is constantly in movement, it's constantly serving the body because that's its whole existence. And as a result, it's weak, since its whole existence and being is only for all the other limbs, so it doesn't have its own being on its own independently, so it's a weak existence, it's a weak entity. Whereas the mayach is removed from the other limbs of the body. It's true that it's the source of the highest of the body, but it remains removed from them, which reflects that it's a being for itself. It also provides chayes, but it's its own thing. It's removed from the limbs, and in addition, it provides chayes, and therefore it doesn't have movement, which reflects that it's removed from the limbs of the body, because it has its own existence. And number two, it's not weak like the lave. It's not the weakest limb. It's not the weakest part of the body, since it's an existence, an entity for itself. So whatever strength, whatever koyach it has, even if it's more or less, but it has its own koyach, unlike the lave. And therefore, a melech is specifically compared to a lave, because also a melech has these two qualities of a lave. On one hand, he's in a constant connection to the nation, asher yitziyim v'asher yavim, because the whole inyan of Melucha is to serve the nation. So he has to constantly be serving them. And for that very reason, there's a weakness in his existence compared to the nation, that he receives all of his needs from them. So that's why the melech is compared to the lave, because of this aspect that we spoke about, that differentiates a melech from a nasi. To elaborate a little more on this, we also find the similarity of the above difference between the Lev and Mayach by the Koichas HaNefesh, which are in the Lev and Mayach, which the Koichas that are in them is the Seichel and the Midas. The Seichel, the inyan of Seichel, which is in the Mayach, so the inyan of Seichel, which is to understand something, can only truly be when a person remains removed from the thing they want to understand. The person has to see it objectively, remove themselves from it. If the thing is connected to the seichel, the person has an attachment to it, so then that's shoichar, causing a person not to understand the idea properly. They won't have a proper understanding because they have a connection to it. They have to remove themselves from it and see it objectively. Whereas the inyan of midas is the feelings of the person to the thing, which comes about through a person connecting themselves to the thing until it brings about a feeling of closeness or the opposite inside the person. And this results in the differences between seichel and midas. That midas, number one, the inyan of midas is excitement, which is the idea of movement, whereas seichel requires his beinunus, his yashvus, menucha. It has to be settled. It doesn't have that excitement, that movement. And the second difference is, which is that midas aren't a strong, long-lasting entity. They are prone to change. Today a person feels this way, and tomorrow a person feels differently. A person could get different feelings, and they could go from one extreme to the other extreme. Whereas true seichel doesn't change. When seichel comes to a conclusion, it's because that's the truth. That's why it came to that conclusion. And therefore, it doesn't change. Which again, we see these two ideas that we mentioned that exist in the Lev and Mayach, we see them reflected in the koiches that manifest themselves in the Lev and Mayach. According to this, we can understand the difference between a melech and a nasi. A melech, whose inyan is asher yitzim v'asher yavim, so he is occupied and invested. His whole metzius, his whole occupation is in providing the nation with their needs, similar to the lave giving chayes to the body. So his inyan isn't seichel and heira. His inyan is to be involved with the nation. Specifically, the nasi, who remains removed from the nation. So his inyan is to be the Reish and Mayach of the nation, to determine the Psak Din of Torah for all the matters of the nation. Like we said, we find by the Mayach and by the Seichel that it's removed, and therefore it's connected to Hira. And therefore Hanasi, also the aspect found in the Melech, it says Hanasi hu akel, since also the Lev receives from the Mayach. So now we're understanding not just why the Melech is compared to a Lev, but also why the Nasi is compared to the Reish and Mayach. Because the inyan of the Lev is to bring the chayas, also that from the mayach, to all the limbs. And we also find this by a melech, by an actual melech, that his inyan is to implement by the nation the irais of the Torah, which are determined and given out by the Nasi and the Sanhedrin. And this is to the extent that it says about a melech, that mitzvah la melech l'chabed leim de Torah, u'cheshi yikansu l'fanav Sanhedrin v'chachmei Yisrael yamed l'fneim. He has to give honor to the Sanhedrin and to those who learn Torah. Now, to conclude that in addition to all of this, there's a special emphasis in these ideas regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, from who we learn that Anasu Hakel. We learn it from Moshe Rabbeinu, and there's a special emphasis of all this by Moshe Rabbeinu, that by him there were both aspects of Lev and Mayach. Moshe was a melech, as it says, Vahi B'Shur Melech, and he occupied himself with providing Yidden with all their needs, even the Gashmias, which is the Inyan of Lev, and at the same time, he was a Nasi and Rish Sanhedrin, and even more so, all matters of Torah, and for all generations, are part of Teras Moshe Avdi. It says Zichru Teras Moshe Avdi. He was the one who was Kibbutz Torah Sinai, and he learned Torah with all the Yidden, which is the Inyan of Mayach. And similarly, we find by Mashiach that Moshe Hu Goel Rishon and Hu Goel Acharein, that we also find by him both Inyanim. He was a Melech, and to the contrary, it says he will have the Inyan of Malchus B'Shleimus. He's not just also a melech, by him it's going to be b'shleimus, and together with that, he is a Rav who will teach the whole nation Torah, may it be b'karev mamash.